The sun was falling behind the long hills of Malwe Valley, and the red light of evening spread across the savannah. Like warm paint on old earth, as Kofi sat in the back seat of the taxi, feeling the gentle shake of the road beneath the wheels and hearing the distant sound of drums coming from a village far behind them. He had been traveling since morning, passing villages, forests, and open grasslands where the tall, dry grass moved like the breath of sleeping spirits, and now he only wanted to reach the river town of Luma before night came fully, because he had heard many warnings from elders about traveling after dark in this region. Yet he could not turn back now, for his journey was important, and time was already slipping away like water in a cracked pot. The taxi driver, a quiet middle-aged man named Abedi, kept his eyes on the dusty road, and his hands gripped the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. He hummed softly under his breath a tune that sounded ancient and heavy, filled with sorrow and warning, the kind of tune passed down from ancestors who had walked through jungles and fought spiritual storms and crossed rivers filled with ghosts. And when the wind blew through the open windows, Kofi felt a sudden coldness on his skin, even though the air outside was warm. It was the kind of coldness that comes from something unseen, something that watches from the shadows of trees, or the tall grass, or the spaces between villages. Kofi leaned forward a little, wanting to ask Abedi how long until they reached Luma, but before he spoke, he noticed something strange. The driver was not looking at the road ahead anymore. His eyes kept jumping from the dirt path to the darkening sky to the trees to the side mirror, as if he expected something or someone to appear without warning. Kofi felt his heart begin to beat harder, and a thin edge of fear touched him, even though he did not know why. So he cleared his throat gently and asked if everything was fine. Abedi did not answer. At first he swallowed hard, and his voice came slow and low, like a man speaking while carrying a heavy burden. He said, "The night comes fast in this place, and the night does not always come alone." And then he fell silent again, leaving Kofi with more questions than answers. The taxi rolled forward slowly, and the sky lost its color as darkness spread across the land, like a lid closing over the world. The drums in the distance had stopped now, and the silence felt strange, too thick, too full, like it was hiding something alive. Kofi looked out the window and saw the outline of distant mountains, their shapes sharp against the sky. They looked like crouching giants, and the forest at their base looked darker than night should allow, as if a great shadow had fallen across it. He touched the small charm tied around his neck, the charm his grandmother had given him before he left home. She told him it would protect him from wandering spirits and jealous ancestors and creatures that moved through the land with silent feet. He never believed much in such things, but right now he held the charm tightly because something inside him whispered that he might need it before this night ended. Road curved, and the taxi slowed a little as loose stones cracked beneath the tires. Then Abedi looked into the mirror again and whispered something too soft for Kofi to hear. Kofi leaned forward and asked what he said, but the driver shook his head firmly and told him not to worry, that they would reach Loomis soon. But his voice trembled, and Kofi noticed that even though the road was empty and the fields were quiet, Abedi kept glancing behind them as if something unseen followed close by, hiding. In the dust of their journey, Kofi began to feel a weight inside his chest, a pressure that came not from the heat or the long journey, but from the sense that something waited upon the road ahead. Something old, something dangerous, something connected to the land and the stories elders told around firelight, the stories travelers always laughed at in daylight, but remembered with fear when shadows grew long. The taxi reached a narrow crossing where tall trees grew on both sides, forming a long, dark tunnel, and as they entered the tunnel of leaves, the wind suddenly died. Every insect sound disappeared. Even the engine sounded softer, like it did not want to disturb whatever lived in the shadows. Kofi felt the air change. It grew heavy, damp, and cold, as though they had stepped into the mouth of something ancient. Abedi's fingers tightened on the wheel, and he whispered a short prayer in his mother tongue, asking the ancestors to protect them from the wandering ones. There was no light inside the tunnel except the pale glow from the fading sky behind them, and the dim headlamps of the taxi. The leaves above hung low like hands trying to close around them. The shadows looked alive, moving, twisting, leaning toward the vehicle as if trying to see who dared enter their path. Kofi felt his breath catch in his throat, and he focused on the charm around his neck, whispering his grandmother's blessing in his mind. Then, without warning, Ebony hit the brakes. The taxi jerked hard and stopped in the middle of the dark path. Kofi grabbed the seat in front of him to keep from sliding forward, and he quickly looked around, expecting to see an animal or a fallen tree or something blocking their way, but there was nothing. The road ahead was empty, the shadows still, but Abedi stared forward with wide, trembling eyes, as if he saw something standing in the middle of the path, even though Kofi saw nothing but darkness. Kofi asked what was wrong, but before he finished speaking, Abedi turned to him, his voice shaking, and said with fear that felt too real to be ignored, "Do not get out here. Trust me." The words rushed out like a warning from someone who had seen death many times. Then he leaned back and breathed heavily as though something pressed on his chest. Kofi felt his skin crawl, and an urge to look behind the taxi filled him, but he forced himself to stay still. Suddenly, from far behind them, a single sound rose in the silence. The distant wailing of a horn, a sound that did not belong to a car or any human instrument. It was long, deep, and full of sorrow, like the cry of a spirit mourning the living. The sound grew louder, slowly coming closer, as if whatever made it was moving toward them. Kofi felt his heart drop, and his hands turned cold. Abede quickly turned the key, and the engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. Like a frightened animal, the taxi jumped forward and sped through the narrow tunnel of trees, the branches scraping the sides like claws trying to hold them. The strange horn cry echoed behind them, growing closer, then suddenly disappeared, leaving only the pounding of the engine and the harsh breathing of the two men. The road opened into a small clearing, and for a moment Kofi felt relief because they had escaped the tunnel, but before he could speak, flashing lights appeared ahead, bright, sharp, and blinding. Police vehicles surrounded the exit of the clearing, forming a barrier across the road. Officers stepped out holding lanterns and rifles, their faces serious, their movement fast and urgent. Abedi cursed under his breath and hit the brakes again. The taxi slid to a stop in front of the armed officers, dust rising around them like smoke. Kofi felt the fear rise again, because he did not understand what was happening. He did not understand why police would block this lonely forest road at night, or why Abedi looked even more terrified now than he had inside the dark tunnel. One of the officers stepped forward, raising his hand for them to stay inside the vehicle, his voice cold but urgent as he shouted through the night air, telling them not to move. Kofi turned to Abedi, the question forming on his lips, but before he spoke, the driver whispered again the same words filled with the same deep fear. "Do not get out here, trust me." And Kofi felt the night tighten around him, as if the darkness itself was listening, waiting, breathing close enough to touch him. The police lights shone like restless spirits flickering in the clearing, and the air grew heavy, as if the night itself held its breath, while Kofi sat frozen in the back seat, feeling the deep thrum of fear moving through his chest. And Abedi kept his hands tight on the wheel, trembling, like a man who knew the land's darkest secrets and wished he had never lived long enough to see them. Again, the police officer stepped closer, his lantern lifting a warm yellow glow over the taxi windows, and his eyes were narrow and urgent, as if he expected danger to leap from any direction. Without warning, the clearing smelled of dust and old roots, and the far wind carried a strange, dry whistle like someone softly calling a forgotten name from the shadows. The officer raised his hand again, telling them to stay inside the vehicle, and his voice cracked with the weight of fear that was too strong to hide, and that fear spread through the air, reaching Kofi like cold fingers gripping his shoulders. He leaned forward and whispered to Abedi, asking what was happening, what danger waited in this strange place, why the police moved like hunters stalking an invisible beast. But Abedi only shook his head slowly, his breath shallow, his face shining with sweat in the lantern light, and he whispered that some things of the night did not want to be named, and some ancient paths should never be entered after sunset. The forest around the clearing stood tall and silent, as though listening to every breath, every heartbeat. The leaves did not move, the grass did not sway. Even the insects were gone, as if the world had paused its life to watch the moment unfold. And Kofi felt as though dozens of unseen eyes stared from between the trees' eyes. That remembered old rituals, old blood, old promises. The ground seemed to pulse lightly beneath his feet, like the earth kept its own terrified heartbeat. Officer nearest to the taxi leaned in, lowered his voice, and told Abedi that something had been following the taxi from the tunnel, something the patrol had sensed before they saw the lights of the taxi approaching. And the other officers tightened their circle, holding their rifles with fear, not authority, their movements careful, desperate. The way people move when they know the enemy is invisible and stronger than them all. Kofi felt his stomach twist as cold dread crawled up his spine. Abedi said nothing, he only stared ahead into the dark clearing where shadows pooled thick like spilled ink. Kofi tried to look beyond the officers to the road ahead, but the darkness was too deep, too complete, as though the night had swallowed the path and replaced it with a silent waiting void. Then suddenly the farthest officer lifted his lantern high and gasped loud enough for all to hear his voice, breaking through the stillness, and every head turned toward the thick line of trees at the edge of the clearing, where something shifted, something tall, something that moved without sound or weight, like a shadow peeling itself away from the darkness. The officers stepped back, fear taking hold of their legs, and one whispered, "Ancestor, protect us." His voice trembling. The shadow form moved slowly, swaying like smoke in windless air, but there was no wind, and its shape stretched long like the trunk of a dead tree, yet bent and curved like something alive and older than the forest itself. Kofi felt his throat tighten as fear crushed him, because he knew from the deep old stories that some spirits of the land were hunters of wandering souls, and they walked only on nights when silence ruled the earth. Abedi reached across the seat and pressed a shaking hand against Kofi's arm, whispering not to look directly at it, because the old stories said that the wandering shadow fed on the gaze of the living, and seeing it clearly meant giving it a path into your spirit. But Kofi could not stop himself from glancing again, trying to understand what chased them, what made the police tremble like children before a storm. The shadow shape leaned forward, stretching like a long neck, tasting the air, and then shrank back, like mist pulled by an unseen force, as if playing with the edge of the clearing, waiting, choosing. Then the police officer closest to the trees shouted for everyone to stay back, his voice cracking as he fired his rifle into the darkness. The gunshot cracked through the night, and for a heartbeat, the clearing echoed with a sharp sound, but the shadows did not react. They only thickened and twisted, as if absorbing the noise, drinking the fear. Then the rifle's lantern flickered and went out, plunging half the clearing into darkness, and the officers stumbled backward, tripping on roots and grass. Unable to hide the pure terror in their eyes, Abedi suddenly leaned closer to Kofi and whispered the old name of the spirit, a name villagers never spoke at night, a name that carried stories of missing travelers and paths that shifted beneath their feet, a name said to belong to a spirit that followed the living when it smelled fear. He whispered that the spirit walked in search of debts, unpaid promises, broken souls. Unprotected Kofi held his charm tight against his chest, praying silently to the ancestors to guard his spirit and keep his breath inside his body, because the night felt like a mouth ready to swallow them whole. Suddenly, two officers moved forward, lifting a wooden staff carved with ancient symbols, the kind used by village elders during cleansing rituals, and one officer began chanting in a trembling Voice calling the ancestors, calling the land, calling the river spirits for protection. The chant rose, shaky but determined, and for a moment, the darkness near the trees seemed to pull back just a little, like a beast annoyed by the touch of firelight, but not frightened enough to leave. The ground beneath the taxi shivered lightly, and a cold wind formed from nowhere, twisting through the clearing, brushing against Kofi's skin with fingers that felt sharp and ancient. Betty gasped and muttered that the spirit was not outside the clearing anymore, but already inside the circle of men and metal and lanterns. The officers heard it too because they tightened their positions, forming a ring around the taxi as if guarding it from all sides, their breath loud and uneven in the tense silence. Then the air changed again, becoming thick like wet cloth, and the smell of rotten earth crossed the clearing. A smell like graves opened by unseen hands, and Kofi felt tears gather in his eyes because his body recognized the scent, even though his mind did not. The scent of something older than death, something not meant for the living. Betty shook his head and whispered that the spirit was choosing someone for the night, someone to follow, someone to claim before Kofi could speak. Something brushed the side of the taxi. Not a physical hand, not an animal paw, but a cold ripple, the kind that chills bone and stops breath. The officers shouted, raising their rifles again, and lanterns swung wildly, throwing shaking beams of light across the clearing. The shadow near the trees grew taller, rising like a giant woven from darkness, its form bending like smoke, but its presence heavy like a mountain pressing down on the land. Kofi shut his eyes tight, but he still felt the weight of it, the stare of it, the hunger of it. Police captain stepped forward with the carved staff, shouting louder, calling the ancestors to stand between the living and the wandering shadow, and the other officers gathered behind him, chanting the same broken ritual, their voices full of fear and hope tangled together. The shadow paused, its stretching form rippling as if considering whether to move forward or wait a moment longer. The chanting grew louder, filling the clearing with trembling human courage, and for a moment it seemed the spirit hesitated. But the night did not release its grip. It deepened the darkness, thickened. The forest whispered, and the ground pulsed again, as if a heartbeat rose from deep beneath the soil, and that pulse echoed through Kofi's body like a slow drum calling his soul by name. He gasped and clutched the charm around his neck, feeling it warm suddenly with a soft glow. The charm pulsed in his palm like a tiny heart, responding to the ancient beat beneath the earth. Betty stared at the charm with wide, fearful eyes, whispering that only chosen blood made a charm wait with light, and that meant Kofi was no longer a traveler passing through the night, but someone the spirit had marked, someone the ancestors had drawn into an old story. Older than both men, older than the police, older than the road, older than the forest itself. The wind rose, suddenly swirling dust around the taxi, and the officers lifted their arms to shield their faces, their lanterns shaking wildly in their hands. The shadow moved again, slowly leaning forward, stretching across the ground toward the taxi like a long silent roar of darkness, and the officers shouted, but their voices broke. Their chants faltered. The light from their lanterns shrank as though pulled by invisible threads. Kofi felt the air thinning as if every breath took more effort, and he saw the shadow reach the front of the taxi, the shape rippling across the metal like smoke curling over a stone. Betty grabbed Kofi's wrist and shouted with a voice cracking from terror, "Do not step out, no matter what happens. No matter what you hear, the spirit wants you to move, wants you to leave. The circle wants you to stand where its shadow can touch your feet. Do not get out, trust me." As the night pressed in, and the police struggled to hold their circle, the wandering spirit choosing its moment to strike, and Kofi realized the darkness of the road had only been the beginning of the terror waiting for him in the heart of the forest. The shadow spread across the front of the taxi like a dark wave moving without weight or sound, and the air grew colder until Kofi felt as if night itself pressed against his skin, trying to sink through his flesh and reach the deepest parts of him. The officers tightened their circle, lifting their rifles and lanterns higher, but their hands shook and their voices were uneven because the spirit before them was not something metal could stop nor something light could chase away. It was ancient, it was patient, it was a hunter of fear, and it had already tasted the fear inside the clearing. The dust, the breath, the trembling hearts of the living. Kofi felt the old beat under the ground again, a slow, powerful rhythm like a giant heart buried beneath the earth, and the charm in his hand pulsed with that same rhythm, glowing with faint warm light, like fire inside stone. And Betty stared at it in horror, whispering that the ancestors did not give such light without reason, and that reason was never small, never safe, never simple. The shadow began to rise from the ground, lifting into a tall shape, like a twisted figure made of night. Its arms long like branches, its body thin like smoke, its head stretching upward until it almost touched the tops of the trees. The lanterns flickered weakly, as though their flames feared to stand before the spirit, and the officers stepped back, their boots sliding on the dry earth, their breaths loud in the silent, clearing some whispered prayers. Others called for ancestors, others trembled too hard to speak at all. Kofi could feel the spirit's attention turn toward him. Even though he kept his eyes low and refused to look at it directly, its presence felt like heavy fingers pressing against his back, as if testing him, measuring him, choosing him. The police captain stepped forward, holding the carved ancestral staff with both hands, chanting louder, this time calling river spirits, mountain spirits, forest spirits to stand between the living and the wandering shadow. His voice shook, but he did not stop, even when the shadow leaned forward, as if listening to the chant, smelling the courage. Behind it, the staff glowed faintly with old power carved into it by hands long gone, and the captain raised it higher, pushing the staff's tip toward the spirit. The air crackled, as if lightning crawled across unseen paths, yet the shadow did not retreat. It only shifted its head shape, a little tilting, as though curious about the staff and the faint courage of the living man who held it. Kofi felt something strange building inside his chest, a warm rising pressure that did not feel like fear. It felt like something answering the call of the earth beating beneath him. Something awakened by the spirit's presence, something awakened by the charm glowing in his hand. He tried to breathe slowly, but each breath carried the weight of unseen worlds and ancient memories he did not understand. He heard a Betty whisper that the spirit was seeking the marked soul, and the charm had marked him already. And that meant the ancestors had chosen him for something dangerous, something he could not run from, even if he tried. Suddenly, the ground shook again, a low tremor rising through the soles of their feet and spreading across the clearing like a warning drumbeat. The officers stumbled, their lanterns swinging wildly, throwing broken light across the trees and branches and shadows. The spirit's form rippled as if stirred by the tremor, stretching its long arm toward the captain, who stood in front holding the staff. The captain shouted louder, pushing the staff forward, and the carved symbols glowed brighter, but the shadow did not stop. Its long arm reached around the glow, bending like smoke, yet carrying weight like a river current, and brushed the air near the captain's face. The man gasped, stumbling back as the shadowy limb passed through the lantern flames, making them flicker cold blue for a heartbeat. Before returning to their dim goal, two officers ran to steady the captain, pulling him backward, while he chanted faster, trying to regain his strength, and the spirit tilted its head again as if amused by the struggle, and then its attention turned fully toward the taxi. The air tightened around Kofi like an invisible grip, pulling at his breath. He felt the charm burn against his skin, not painful but demanding, as if urging him to stand, to move, to speak, to answer something older than fear. He squeezed the charm in his hand, whispering to his grandmother's memory, asking for guidance, begging the ancestors to silence whatever called to him from the darkness. Spirit floated closer to the taxi, its body stretching across the ground like flowing ink, its tall upper shape leaning down toward the window where Kofi sat unmoving with clenched jaw and shaking hands. The shadow's face shifted like black mist swirling yet never forming clear features, but Kofi felt eyes on him, eyes not made of flesh or light but of memory and hunger and ancient purpose. He lowered his head, trying not to meet the invisible gaze, yet he felt the spirit pulling at him as though trying to lift his soul out through his chest and carry it. Into the trees Abedi grabbed his arm, shouting, "Do not look, do not move, do not let it find your gaze," but Kofi already felt the pull growing stronger like a tide rising inside him. Then, without warning, the charm in his hand grew hot and bright, glowing like a small sun, and the spirit stopped its movement, its body rippling with sudden agitation. The officers gasped, stepping back as the light grew stronger, spilling through Kofi's fingers like golden water. The spirit's tall form leaned back, its edges flickering as if the charm's light stung it like fire. Kofi felt the heat spreading through his arm into his chest, into his head, and his vision blurred with warm gold like the glow from a fire burning behind his eyes. He felt himself drifting, and he heard a voice, soft, ancient, deep, not in the air, but inside his mind, calling him by name, calling him by his true blood name, the one only the ancestors knew. The voice whispered that the wandering shadow did not come by accident. It came because an old debt had awakened the bloodline of a forgotten ancestor, a warrior who once walked between the living and the spirits, and whose strength now rested inside him. The voice told him he must rise, he must stand, he must face what hunted him, for if he did not, the spirit would not only claim him, but also claim the land around them, turning night into a path of wandering souls forever. He wanted to shout, he wanted to ask questions, he wanted to deny the voice, but the golden heat inside him wrapped his thoughts like warm cloth, guiding him, lifting him, pushing him toward something he feared and did not understand. Suddenly, the charm's glow dimmed, and the ground shook again stronger, this time sending dust into the air and making the officers stumble and fall. The spirit surged forward, its tall form twisting violently as if angered by the interruption. Its long arms shot toward the taxi, passing through metal like smoke, yet carrying a powerful force that shook the entire vehicle, making the windows creak and the roof bend slightly. Kofi cried out, gripping the seat as the spirit's arm reached toward him, and Abedi screamed for the officers to help, shouting that the spirit was taking him. The captain raised the staff again, but the glowing symbols flickered weakly, as if the staff itself feared the spirit's rage. Kofi felt his body lifting slightly, as though the air beneath him had turned into hands trying to pull him out of the taxi. He kicked against the seat, gripping the charm tightly until his knuckles ached, and the charm suddenly flashed again, a sharp burst of golden light that cracked through the shadowed arm, making it ripple and recoil with a soundless shriek. The entire clearing shivered as if the trees, the ground, even the air itself reacted to the clash of power, and the spirit curled back, pulling its twisted form away from the taxi, its tall shape trembling like smoke, shaken by a sudden wind. The officers shouted in shock, some dropping their lanterns. As the flames flickered wildly, the captain ran to the side of the taxi, urging Kofi to step out, but Abedi grabbed him, shouting, "No, do not trust. Leave the circle, and the spirit will claim you." The captain insisted that the staff would protect him, but Abedi shook his head violently, saying the spirit was not after the body, but the soul, and only the charm had held it back. Kofi felt dizzy, the charm heavy in his palm, the golden heat fading, leaving him cold and weak. He looked at the captain, then at Abedi, then at the trembling spirit gathering itself again at the edge of the clearing, and he knew something had changed forever. Something had awakened inside him, something that would not allow him to walk away from this night untouched. The wind rose again, swirling dust in high circles, and the spirit's form expanded, stretching across the trees, its shadowy presence filling The clearing, like a storm cloud ready to strike, the officers, filled with dread, tightened their ring raising. Their rifles, their voices blending with the trembling chant of the captain, and Kofi, with trembling hands, pressed the charm to his chest, feeling its faint, remaining warmth, hoping it would wake again, hoping it would shield him once more, because the spirit was coming back stronger, hungrier, determined to reach him, and the night was far from over. The wind swirled around the clearing, lifting dust, leaves, and small dry roots into the air, as if the night itself breathed with rising anger, and Kofi sat frozen inside the taxi, clutching the charm that had saved him, once yet felt weak now, almost asleep like a tired guardian, unable to rise again too soon. The spirit stretched tall across the trees, its long twisted form swirling like a storm cloud shaped into a thin, hungry figure, and every officer in the clearing stepped back in fear, their rifles trembling, their lantern flames bending sideways, as if bowing to the ancient darkness that approached. The police captain shouted for everyone to hold formation, to keep the circle unbroken, but even his voice shook like a cracked drum, unable to command the terror creeping through every lung, every limb, every breath. Abedi leaned toward Kofi, gripping his arm tightly, begging him to listen with every part of his soul, saying, "The charm is tired, the spirit is angry, it will come for you first. And if you step out, if you leave the circle of the living, you will be taken before any weapon can move, before any voice can call you back." Kofi tried to speak, but the pressure in his chest made his voice weak, because the spirit seemed to pour weight through the air, pressing on him alone, as if the entire clearing was only a path leading to him, and him alone. He hugged his arms around himself, trying to steady his breath, while the charm pulsed faintly against his skin, not glowing, not strong, but still alive, like a sleeping heart struggling to wake. The captain pushed through the officers and came to the window, urging Kofi again to step out, saying the only way to protect him was to bring him to the center of the ritual circle, where the ancestral staff could shield his spirit. But Abede screamed no louder than before, his voice breaking, saying the spirit wants him in the open, not protected by metal, and not hidden inside the taxi, because spirits see metal as a barrier, a shell, a closed door, and if Kofi left the taxi, the spirit would reach him like smoke reaching firewood. Kofi looked from one man to the other, feeling pulled by fear and confusion, and then the ground trembled as the spirit lifted its long dark arm, sending a cold rush of air across the clearing that made the lanterns flicker blue again, and the trees groan like frightened animals. The tremor made Kofi fall back in the sea, and the captain stumbled, but kept the staff raised, chanting in a loud rhythm older than any language taught in schools, a rhythm carried by elders through generations, like a heartbeat of forgotten kingdoms. The carved symbols glowed weakly, fighting against the dark weight pushing into the clearing, but the light shook like a flame in heavy wind, flickering, threatening to die out at any moment. The spirit shifted, narrowing its shape into a tall, thin spear-like form, pointing itself toward the taxi. The air gathered tightly around the clearing like a giant hand squeezing the breath from every chest. Kofi felt his heart beating too fast, and the charm warming slightly in his palm, but still not lighting, still not rising. The officers backed away further, some shouting prayers, some shaking too hard to keep their rifles steady, and one officer whispered that the spirit was not wandering anymore. It was hunting with clear intention, and that made it far more dangerous. The spirit floated forward, moving with slow, terrible grace, like a shadow drifting across water, its long fingers crawling across the ground like searching roots, reaching for the metal of the taxi. The captain shouted, pushing the staff forward again, sending a weak wave of light across the dirt, but the spirit sliced through the glow as if cutting through mist, and the officers shouted in despair because the chant was losing strength. The staff was losing power, and the spirit was no longer waiting, it was claiming. Kofi felt the air around him turn colder than any night he had known, colder than river water, colder than mountain wind, colder than death itself. and he felt that cold settle. Inside his bones, pushing toward his chest, where the charm lay, he pressed the charm, harder, whispering to his grandmother, calling to the ancestors, calling to anything still listening in the ancient, unseen world. But the voice inside him was met with silence, as if the ancestors held their breath or watched, waiting for something. He could not yet understand. He felt small, helpless, trapped between two kinds of death, the physical and the spiritual, and he felt the heavy truth that the spirit wanted not his body, but the light inside him, the old blood, the ancient line, carrying a forgotten debt suddenly. The spirit's long arm surged forward, passing through the hood of the taxi like mist sliding through cloth, and the metal groaned, bending inward as if crushed by invisible weight. Kofi screamed as the cold shadow reached toward him, sliding across the dashboard, curling like smoke near his legs, and a Betty shouted, pulling at him, trying to push him further back, as if distance inside. The taxi could save him, but the arm of darkness moved with intelligent hunger, bending directly toward Kofi's chest, drawn by the charm's faint glow, drawn by the ancient blood inside him, drawn by the mark he did not know he carried before the shadow could reach him. The charm pulsed once, a single bright burst that shot through Kofi's hand into the air, sending a quick flash across the taxi interior. The spirit recoiled, twisting violently like smoke hit by sudden wind, its tall form rippling with silent rage. But the charm fell silent again, almost lifeless, dim and cold, as if that single burst had drained its remaining strength and left it unable to rise once more. A Betty gasped, because even he could feel the charm's energy fading like a tired heartbeat, and he whispered that the ancestors were not refusing him. They were waiting for something he had not done, something he had not seen, something he had not understood. The spirit swelled bigger, now its shape doubling in size, stretching high into the night sky as though drawing power from the darkness itself, and the cold wind howled through the clearing, lifting dust into spirals that circled the officers and made their lantern flames waver. The captain shouted for everyone to hold formation, to chant louder, but fear cracked their unity. Their voices stumbled, their steps faltered, and the circle broke slightly, leaving small gaps in the ring of protection. The spirit saw the weakness and surged forward, its long body sweeping across the clearing like a storm wave, bending branches and shaking the earth underfoot. The captain rushed toward the taxi, raising the staff, shouting for Kofi to open the door, saying they must move him now, must place him inside the small inner circle formed by ancestral lines cut into the soil earlier that night. But Kofi felt something deep inside him, a pull that was not from the spirit, not from fear, but from the golden warmth that had filled him when the charm glowed earlier, a memory of the voice calling his true name, telling him he must rise and face the darkness, not hide from it, not run from it. And suddenly he understood something, though not completely. He understood that the charm and the staff and the chants were only shields, not weapons, and what the ancestors wanted was not for him to hide behind shields, but to stand and answer whatever old debt the spirit carried. He pushed open the door, ignoring Abdi's horrified cry, and stepped out into the clearing, his legs trembling, but carrying him forward, and the officers shouted no, some reaching for him, but too late, because his feet had already touched the ground outside, the circle of metal and shadow, and the spirit turned, its whole massive head shaped toward him, the air tightening like a clenched fist around the clearing. Kofi held the charm against his chest, though. It no longer glowed, and the cold from the spirit washed over him, freezing the breath inside his lungs. But he kept walking, one slow, shaking step after another, until he stood a few paces in front of the taxi, staring at the towering shadow that now leaned forward, lowering its tall form until it seemed to crouch before him like a giant beast studying its chosen prey. Captain shouted the staff, glowing weakly, trying to push between Kofi and the spirit, but Kofi lifted a hand, telling him silently to stay back, not with words, but with the quiet understanding rising inside him, like a voice he could not hear, but could feel. The officers watched in terror. some whispering that he was sacrificing himself, others begging the ancestors to intervene, but the spirit ignored all of them, its attention locked entirely on Kofi, whose heartbeat echoed louder in his own ears with every passing second. The charm lay, still cold heavy in his hand, but the warmth inside his chest grew brighter. A strange warmth rising like the first spark of a fire buried under ash. The spirit lowered its long twisting arm toward him, reaching not with violence, but with purpose, like a hand demanding recognition, and Kofi slowly raised his own hand, though it shook like a leaf in storm wind. The cold shadow brushed his palm, sending a shock through his body like falling into deep river water, and suddenly the world around him faded, the clearing, the officers, the trees, the lanterns, even the whispers of the night all slipped away, replaced by darkness alive with whispers and memories older than the land itself, and he felt himself falling not downward but inward into a place where the ancestors waited, watching silent and unseen, and the night in the clearing held its breath, because Kofi was no longer just a traveler caught in the spirit's path. He was stepping into an ancient story that had waited generations for someone with his blood to walk into it. The night around the taxi burned with the red and blue lights of the police trucks, and Kaio felt the air grow tight like an old drum, being stretched too far, and the spirits in the forest stirred with a wind that carried the smell of dust fire and distant drums that no human hand was beating. As Kaio looked at the police stepping forward with shields raised and weapons ready, the air felt heavy, and the old taxi driver gripped the steering wheel hard, as if trying to hold the world together with his fingers, and Kaio saw fear in his eyes, fear deep like the kind that lived in the river when the moon was swallowed by clouds and the crocodiles swam close to the shore, hunting in silence, and the old man's voice trembled, saying, "My son, listen to what I tell you tonight, because what comes now is not only for the living, but also for the ones who walk behind us unseen and unheard." And Kaio felt a tremor run through his chest as the old man opened his mouth again, but stopped, because the wind suddenly went silent, the night fell still, and even the insects seemed to choke on their own breath as something heavy and invisible walked through the trees with slow, careful steps, and the police did not hear it, but Kaio did, and so did the old man, who whispered under his breath an ancient prayer in a language older than the mountains on the horizon. And the moment he spoke that prayer, the police captain shouted orders, telling his men to brace themselves and surround the taxi completely, while the headlights of their trucks cut through the darkness like angry spears, and the earth under the taxi shivered like something huge was moving beneath the soil. And Kaio looked at the old man and asked again, "Baba, what is happening? What danger is this? Who are they looking for? And why did you stop here?" And the taxi driver breathed slowly, as if gathering the courage of all ancestors before him. Then he turned his face toward Kaio, and his eyes seemed dimmer, older, more tired than ever before, and he said, "My son, this place is cursed not because of the spirits of the dead, but because of the living, who sold their own people to the night, and the police are not here to save us. They are here because they are afraid of what followed us from the village, and afraid of what waits for them in this darkness." And Kaio felt his throat tighten as he remembered the old woman on the road, the one who stood bare feet, dusty eyes on fire, her voice cracked with sorrow, warning him that something had marked him. And now he understood that the danger was not random. It was not simple. It was something woven long before he was born, and yet he was standing right in the middle of its path. The police began shouting again, telling the taxi driver and Kaio to step out, but the old man slammed his hand on the dashboard and said, "No, my son, not yet, because once you leave this car, the spirits will have no barrier from you. This old metal box is the only thing holding the curse from touching you directly." And Kaio felt sweat on his forehead and fear crawling under his skin, but he looked at the officers who were growing impatient, and he knew they would break the door open if he did not obey. And when they reached the windows, Banging with their clubs and shouting commands, the old man finally released a heavy sigh and whispered, "Then so be it." And before Ko could speak, the old man reached under his seat and pulled out a small leather pouch tied with red thread and decorated with white cowrie shells, and when he opened it, a strange warm air escaped from the pouch like the breath of something alive inside, and the wind outside began to move again, carrying the sound of distant wailing as if 100 voices were crying in the forest at once, and Ko felt a cold shiver travel from his neck down to his spine, and he asked Baba, "What is that? What is inside?" And the old man answered, "This is the protection my grandmother gave to me when I was a boy. She told me that one day a young man would sit in my taxi with a shadow behind him, and I must give him this or both of us would be swallowed by the curse of the night." And when Ko heard those words, his heart beat fast, not with fear alone, but with a strange feeling that he had stepped into a story that was not his, but somehow was waiting for him. Since long before his birth, the police outside were growing more aggressive, banging, harder shouting, angrier, their voices mixing with the wind and the strange cries from the forest, and suddenly the earth shook again harder, this time as if something gigantic rose from the soil, and the police stopped moving for a moment, looking around in confusion and fear, and Ko saw one of the officers drop his weapon and whisper something like a prayer, because the ground began to crack between the trees, and a voice deep, heavy, ancient rose from the darkness, calling Ko's name, slowly stretching each letter like a giant, tasting the sound, and the old taxi driver grabbed Ko's wrist and said, "Now take this pouch, tie it around your neck, and do not open it again, no matter what happens outside, no matter what you see or hear." And Ko did as he was told, his hands shaking as he tied the red thread around his neck, feeling the pouch warm against his chest like a beating heart, and suddenly the world around him seemed clearer. He could hear whispers inside the wind, calling, warning, pleading, and when he looked at the police again, he noticed the shadows around them moving differently, as if something unseen walked past them, brushing their bodies like cold fingers, and the officers looked frightened, confused, stepping back as the forest grew louder with the sound of unseen creatures. Moving between the trees, the old taxi driver unlocked the car doors very slowly and said, "My son, when you step out, do not look at the ground. Do not look at the trees. Do not look at the shadows. Look only at the sky, because if you look at anything else, the curse will see your eyes, and it will not let you go." And Ko's breath shook, but he nodded and opened the door in the moment he stepped out. The wind roared like an angry lion, and the officers surrounding the taxi shouted at him to freeze, but their voices cracked as the earth trembled again, and a black shape rose in the darkness behind them, tall, massive, shifting like smoke and shadow, taking the form of a giant with horns and long arms and a chest that looked like storm clouds inside a human shape, and it let out a deep groan that made the police fall to their knees, covering their ears, and Ko kept his eyes on the sky, just as the old man warned the stars above him, flickering like thousands of tiny spirits watching him, and he felt the pouch heat against his skin, and suddenly the thing in the darkness moved closer, and its shadow covered Ko's feet, and he heard it speak in a voice that felt like thunder, mixed with sorrow, saying, "Child of the broken line, you carry what was lost, you carry what must return." And Ko wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, and the pouch on his chest glowed faint red, and the spirit giant recoiled, slightly, its voice softening, saying, "So the old woman passed her gift to you, then your blood must awaken tonight." And Ko wanted to scream, ask questions, plead, but he kept his eyes locked on the sky, even as the world shook and the trees bent and the police tried to crawl away, and the old taxi driver stood behind Ko, trembling, whispering, "Ancestor, guide him, ancestor. Protect him, ancestor. Open the path for him." And the giant spirit raised its arm, pointing toward the forest, where a path of light appeared, cutting through the darkness like a river of fire. And the spirit said, "Come, the truth waits for you in the heart of the forest. Come before the curse consumes all." And Ko felt his body move forward, not by his choice, but like something inside him pulled him toward that glowing path. And the police shouted for him to stop, but their voices were weak, fading behind the thunder of the spirit, and the wind wrapped around Ko like invisible hands, urging him, pushing him, guiding him into the forest, where the final truth waited, buried in roots, bones, and ancestral fire.